thank you all for joining us on this third day of Charcha2020, online convening largest of its kind dialogue between the development sector. So it's been 2 days of wonderful discussions on a variety of topics. And within the fundraising and philanthropy track, which we've been focused on, we've talked a lot about what investors, funders, philanthropists, NGOs can do to address this crisis that we're all facing. And today we're really going to focus on the role of the government, and specifically how civil society and NGOs can effectively partner with the government. That is really essential for service delivery, and this new normal pretty much requires that sort of collaboration. So this is what this panel discussion is about. We're very, very fortunate. We've got a fantastic panel with us of 5 leading experts who are experts in this topic. And what I'm going to do is, rather than frame the discussion too much, I think it's a topic that all of the NGOs certainly appreciate, and now the government also appreciates. We've got 2 representatives here from civil society as well, who have directly been working with governments and partnering with NGOs. So what I would like to do, with your permission, is to sort of go one by one and request each of our 5 panelists here to share perspectives on what their organization has been doing and how do they really answer this this critical question of how does government leverage A, the capacity, and B, the delivery models of the NGOs, both for short-term relief, whether it's food, shelter, cash, or medium to long-term service delivery, and of course to the most vulnerable and affected segments of the society. So we'll start first with Sudha. Welcome, Sudha. And Sudha is, of course, the CEO of the Nudge Foundation, and or rather the Nudge Center for Social Innovation, who are one of the organizers, the main organizer of this conference. So thank you for catalyzing all of this. Sudha has been leading NCORE and related initiatives to attract and develop top talent working on problems of poverty. She has worked in the technology sector for 16 years in various leadership roles, spanning operations, engineering, and organizational development, but always had a passion to scale up social development and been attracted to the sector. She's an engineer and an MBA from IIM Lucknow. And with that, Sudha, I'd like to hand it over to you and specifically ask you to focus on this issue of, given all the work that you guys do with NGOs, what are the best examples of innovations from the private sector, right, that can improve public systems? And at this time, when the funding from the private sources is drying up, CSR is getting reduced, where is this disruption going to come from? So would love to hear your perspectives, Sudha, on the role of civil society and examples that have worked and not worked.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kartik, for setting the stage, and real honor and pleasure to be here. I struggled with the framing of this a little bit because yes, I think civil society has jumped in a very big way by way of emergency response and relief activity in the wake of COVID, and that has been appreciated by the government a lot. This is very powerful. It happens at scale, but not because there are institutions with capacity for service delivery, but because Indian civil society has a certain ethos and core values of service. Regular citizens step up when there is a crisis, and it can be a COVID crisis or the Kerala floods or a funny cyclone, whatever natural or man-made disaster it is. These values come to fore and very quickly get activated. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen COVID heroes like Khushru Pocha, who runs Seva Kitchen in Pune and jumped in to distribute meals, went without going to sleep for 5 days, I hear. And then we saw startups figure out how to distribute PPEs and do sanitation training on the fly. The reason this works every time is because there's a distributed ability to solve problems at a very local level through motivated people who have the agency to act, and it manifests in a very positive way every time. But there's a different kind of emergency that's not quite the same. It's not about the drowning child, but about the underfed child, the child who's not learning sufficiently at school, or will grow up without gender sensitization or life skills to be self-reliant in the 21st century. It isn't quite as dramatic as a drowning child where you can quickly roll up your sleeves and jump into the river. But this child also needs solutions with the same urgency, because for them, the clock is ticking. There's a point beyond which any help will be too late. That threshold is 5 years when it comes to nutrition. As we all know, stunting and wasting cannot be reversed beyond that point. And similarly, there are thresholds in learning and substance abuse beyond which you cannot help that person. So it is just as urgent. And these are not problems for civil society to solve in the distributed manner that we see relief work happening. This requires institutional investment and capacity for service delivery. And you see it works in a lot of areas like education, health, where nonprofits have seen their roles as innovators and problem solvers. And we have Ashok who will speak later at, I'm sure, about the immense work that Akshara Foundation's done. Basically helping government or public systems improve. And the engine for scale there is the public system. And in the recent times, we've seen so much more work in this kind of model. We've seen technology startups starting to disrupt critical government systems. There's Khushi Baby that's plugged into the Nirogi Rajasthan scheme to extend the reach of immunization programs in maternal health care. We have organizations like People and Transform and Madhi in Tamil Nadu that are improving the quality of service delivery in education. There's Education Alliance in Delhi, which I'm sure those of you working in Delhi are familiar with, that has convened a wide array of solutions through the nonprofit private innovation world. But what's changing with COVID is the funding landscape for these kind of nonprofits. With each one of these that has improved public systems, you'll find that they are themselves privately funded, mostly through foundations and CSR. And we all know that in FY21, they'll be required to do 10x the work with 1/10 the funding. CSR, of course, is likely to go down as a total corpus of available money because, let's face it, all corporates won't be as profitable this year as they were in the past. And even that, the little money that will be available will be directed towards the immediate needs of COVID relief, not for systems change and capacity building. International funding will also reduce because COVID, unfortunately, is a global problem, affects the developed world as much as it has affected us. So in this scenario, we're really seeing the very survival of such nonprofits at risk. So if the government is serious about innovating for the bottom 250 million, and I'm sure it is, then the direction to take with a great sense of urgency is to ensure funding for innovative nonprofits solving problems with a purity of intent. There's a strong analogy to be made with what happened with privatization of several sectors a couple of decades ago. In the early 2000s, you saw privatization was the means to infuse innovation in sectors like aviation and banking, where there was money to be made. Today, it's time for nonprofits to be seen as the leaders of such innovation and to let them into the public system. So while it's an analogy, it's the opposite. Right? Public systems need to provision the programmatic funding needs of such nonprofits and not let it be picked up. There is no CSR to pick it up, right? And that's what we're dealing with. So this way, the capacity for innovation continues, and that innovation can be infused into public systems and sustained in an environment where this private funding is driving up really fast. Government also needs to enable this inflection with the same urgency that it drove changes to the ease of business norms. Right? We need to improve the ease of doing business with government for the non-profit sector as well, and do it in a manner that brings greater transparency, accountability, and quality to public systems, be it education, sanitation, health, across the board. I think these are the necessary conditions for us to be able to do the 10x amount of work that's required, even if philanthropic capital is not going to scale up for this kind of demand. So that I kind of hand it back to you, Kartik.
Wonderful. No, thank you, Sudha. Thank you, Sudha, for putting that so eloquently. I think, love that analogy. The ease of doing business, just like we've done that in sectors in the past for the private sector, the NGO sector also needs to be enabled and catalyzed, and for that there needs to be a buy-in. And really the question is, how do we do that? So with that, we'll come to Viraj. Just a quick introduction first to Viraj. He is the CEO of the eGov Foundation. Viraj is passionate about the impact and jugalbandi, as he puts it, of public digital platforms, policies, and ecosystems in solving complex social issues at scale in an integrated manner, at scale and at speed. Prior to joining eGov, Viraj has been an entrepreneur and a senior corporate leader with a large range of businesses, both in Europe and in India. eGov Foundation, many of you guys would be familiar with. It is doing a lot of very interesting work across the board with multiple governments, really in sort of trying to transform urban governance using scalable and replicable technology solutions, working with different municipal operations to improve their decision making and improve service delivery using as much technology as possible. So Viraj, thank you very much for being with us. Given the nature of the work that you do and the nature of the topic of this panel, I'd love to hear from you as to specifically in the last 6 weeks, what have you guys been focused on? I know that there's this Digit platform that you guys have announced, and could you talk to us a little bit, not just about that, but overall, yes, given the nature of your work, how are state governments responding to this? What sort of interventions are you seeing? And how optimistic are you and your prognosis for as we come out of this lockdown?
Absolutely.
For good public-private collaboration.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, and I think it's very interesting, Sudha, what you said about public goods. Hello. I think I'm getting a bit of a feedback. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, madam, we can hear you clearly.
I'm getting some echo. Hello, it's better now. That's fine. Okay, so I think it's very interesting. I'm very new to this sector, less than 4 years. In fact, Sundeep, I worked with Delhi Commission in 2015 when Ashish Khetan was there, but for 9 months, did some work on policy on water and sewerage. And I think I came from a tech startup, so I had this innate belief that tech can solve a lot of problems. 4 years in, I think I'm wiser, and I think I've got a bit more gray hair. I think I would like to qualify. I think our kind of theory of change has moved from saying tech can solve it to saying tech has to be a foundational layer, and then policy and ecosystem has to play a pivotal role for things to happen. I'll give you some learnings we've had in the last 4 weeks, how creating foundational infra helps solve problems at speed. But I think where I lose sleep these days is that we've got a platform which can potentially go national with central government and with the state government. But where is the local contextual problem solving on that to really make the solutions live? Because given the complexity of and the diversity of problems we have, nobody can no organization or set of organizations can solve it. So Aparna, if you can just, I just want to show a couple of slides just to, and then I'll talk about COVID in specifically. If you can share that. So yeah, I think that's what I think public digital platforms for transformation at scale and speed. If you can go to the next slide. And this is the problem we're trying to solve. How can we transform governance through an open digital infra for 2,000 cities and towns by 2020? And initially, I think first, we're a 17-year-old organization. I would say first 13, 14 years, we would just focus on tech. But as we move forward, if you can flip to the next slide, I will just. And that's what our mantra is now. It is, we feel technology is perhaps a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition to drive solve complex societal challenges. And we use this term Samaj Sarkar Bazaar. Sudha, you also alluded to it. And I would say today almost 60% of energy is actually in non-tech, really working with governments on not just what technology they should use, but what kind of program structures they should have, what kind of reforms they should look at, with the people in non-profit sector on driving local policies changes or local adoption through last mile or first mile, people who are really intermeshed with the local societies, and obviously market players, because we do think marketplace need to play some role here, but some of the policy frameworks and the foundational infra should be there, so that it becomes a level playing field rather than trying to have a land grab. So I think if you go to the next slide, I'll just briefly tell you. So if you see, we are at I think we look at ourselves as only thing we do actively is creating a shared infra, and I'll give you some example of that in terms of how that came into being when we did the code stuff. And essentially, the shared infra is a bit like Android, for a want of a better example, which is a context-independent digital infra, which can be used for multiple use cases, from doing a calendar app to a TikTok. And then there is a participation, which is the co-creation. How do you create diverse solutions? And that's why being a public digital platform is very important. Being open is very important. Having standards is very important, so that other people can, build easily on top of it. And those are the people who really, what we call co-creation environments. And then the final layer is the what we call participation layer or deployment layer, which is amplification network, which is in our case, because service delivery is mainly through government. It's a public service delivery. So we work with governments from the first mile employees who actually do the work in the urban local bodies, to the the service delivery layer, the leadership layer, the municipal commissioners, and then the state leadership, and finally the government in the center. And and some of the amplification also happens through non-profits or NGOs who work in the local communities. In fact, Andhra, we had almost 1,300 volunteers who used to take the public grievance app to the slums and actually files kind of complaints on behalf of people there. So I think this is quite important for us to kind of communicate that unless there is a participation and we make an open infra, innovation at speed cannot happen. If you can flip to the next slide, Aparna. So this is an example of, we built in COVID in 72 hours e-pass system that has been deployed by 9 states. If you see this playing out so at the base was our digit platform, which had workflow. We had things like trade licenses, which is essentially a certificate to do certain things based on certain rules. We had notifications, we had workflow. We just repackaged them, if you will, like a set of Lego blocks. And there were volunteers from, Make My Trip, from iSpirit, who had created their own, who worked this infra to create solution on top of it, which was the COVID e-pass for essential services providers to give bulk e-passes based on a trusted system. We had Unilever working with us to design the process. And finally, the amplification actually happened through the governments. So 9 states came on board in the space of 7 days. And I think it is very important, the point you made, Sudha, about what, somebody can ask this question, this could have been done by a private sector player, but I think the fact that civil society or the non-profits anchored it created a lot of trust in the system. The governments kind of rolled it out in a hurry. The center government approved it. And a lot of market players like EY, PwC, they worked in their respective states to help the governments roll it out. So this happened in a space of 72 hours. People, team of 15 people, some volunteers, some from eGov, worked on this to create this. So I think we believe with the government, the capacity to consume technology and capacity to, even if you make the best technology, unless there's a participation by people who are really entrenched in communities and entrenched in local context, it will still remain a top-down thing. And I believe with the infra that we haven't still achieved 10% of the potential which it might have. So I'll pause here. I think I've run out of time and take any questions later on.
Great. No, thank you, Viraj. We'll definitely come back to questions. Just moving right along, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ashok Kamath, who I don't think needs much of an introduction. He's the chairman and the managing trustee of Akshara Foundation, where he leads strategic planning, analysis, expansion of programs. Akshara is probably one of the largest and most well-known NGOs in the education space. So, Mr. Kamath, we'd lovely to get your perspective on three things. One is, if you could share overall, firstly, how have you and Akshara been so successful in working with government in large states and delivering public education? And how have you been responding to the COVID challenge? Both the short-term challenge of adaptation of operations in the last 6-7 weeks and the long-term ongoing challenge of digital access in affordable education for this underprivileged segment.
Thank you so much, Kartik. Good morning, everyone. Kartik asked me to talk about what we've been doing prior to COVID, which will lend itself to what we did during COVID and what we think we should do after in the post-COVID era. Prior, we were very clear, as much as Viraj talked about, very clear that scale comes only working through the public system. 65% of our children go to schools in the public system. And these are the ones that would get affected in situations like COVID very, very easily. So we work closely with the state. In fact, across the states of Karnataka, Odisha, and Andhra, approximately 100,000 schools use a model that we've developed for teaching math for children between grades 1 and 5. Now, our model leverages existing resources. So teachers are there, so you leverage them. They need to be supplemented and empowered in many ways. So we've created all those tools, whether they are technology-based or in classroom-based processes. And to ensure continuity of classroom instruction in the home, we also created an online property called Building Blocks, which is, again, open source, free product, available, teaches math to children, grades 1 through 5, structured with the curriculum, the national curriculum framework and all the rest of it, and available in 9 Indian languages. So essentially, we have a footprint that probably covers 80–85% of the country. The product also works offline. So that was an important thing that we did. Perhaps a significant part of our model was the creation of local education volunteers who, prior to the COVID attack, were giving us approximately 2 hours per month of quality time. And we have a cadre in Karnataka of approximately 15,000 such workers, such education volunteers, right? So when COVID came about, we had a challenge. Schools were shut, so our people could not go out much. And yet we had this, suboptimal utilization of not only our people, but also this large network of, education volunteers. And we said we would put this to use. So in the 5–6 weeks that just ended yesterday, our people, the volunteers as well as our own people, have reached out to nearly 292,000 households, meeting the households with all the social distancing norms, masks and everything, and advising them and making them aware of the dangers of the virus and what they should be doing and so on. Now, to make this happen, we worked with approximately 14,500 education department officials, from DDPI down to school headmasters, and another 32,800 community members like Gram Panchayat members, school monitoring committee members, and Panchayat development officers and so on. So this, effectively has helped us reach out to, we think conservatively, about 1 million people, if you assume 5 persons per household, we've kind of reached over 1 million people. More important, the Building Blocks app, wherever there were smartphones, we've had the parents install them so that they can keep their children engaged. And on each phone, we can anchor up to 6 children by giving them avatars. So we think upwards of 60,000-70,000 children have now started to do math on a smartphone, on an entry-level smartphone. So this is what we've done during the downtime, during the lockdown period. We are obviously concerned, like everybody else, what happens when schools reopen. We need to worry about distancing, physical distancing norms. We also need to worry about the fact that many of these children need to come to school. If for nothing, they need to come to school to get the midday meal. Many children do depend on that midday meal. We are also aware that if you go fully online, those that don't have digital access devices in their homes will lose, and therefore you need to, that digital divide will, further widen. And of course, the reactions could be that can we have 2 shifts, one in the morning and one in the afternoon? And I feel that in a lot of rural communities, the last bus leaves the village at 4 o'clock. So it's not likely that the teacher is going to stay, beyond that time. So we need to find an alternate to all of this. Our idea was to make this half and half, but with a twist. We are leveraging the MHRD has a platform called Diksha, on which our content is available. And so is content available from multiple other players. Okay, and I'm only talking about open source content that could be used freely. So we are suggesting and working out the details right now that if you have half the children in the classroom with the social distancing norms, the other half could be given homework by scanning. The states are printing textbooks with QR codes that if you scan that, it takes you to the appropriate content on the Diksha platform. So if teachers can, if you can think of a class of 30, I have 15 in the class and 15 are doing homework. And in the homes, the children are basically scanning and studying. And the next day, the children are reversed, and those who are at home, they will be in the classroom tomorrow. Now, what that does is everyone gets the same amount of time from the teacher, and hopefully removes the digital divide. So where do these phones come from, right? So we are saying that there's got to be a way of getting the governments not to buy them, but to lease them and create entrepreneurship in the rural communities. Because remember, with all this migrant population also going back, we're going to have shortages of jobs in rural communities. So can we make some of them, entrepreneurs who will lease these phones to the state, to the schools, in exchange for X rupees per child per month as a lease fee, and they will manage all the logistics. What are the logistics? Every day, the phones have to come back to the school for sanitization and recharging, and the phones get swapped between the kids. Those who are in the classroom don't get the phones. Those who are not in the classroom will carry the phones back. So we're thinking of doing a pilot of this sort to show proof of concept over the next few weeks and see where it takes us. Really, it is important for us to not let the virus get the better of us, because the scare is that children may drop out in large numbers if we don't do things right, and that would be another sign of taking more and more people into poverty. So I think education is key to a robust revival and a robust future. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was extremely, extremely insightful. And, that last point that you mentioned, it couldn't be more true. Many folks are looking at healthcare, obviously, as a critical sector, but education, both for, primary and pre-primary, but also skilling, right? Because it also involves getting people back into their jobs. So, and frankly, skilling of healthcare workers. So as a broad area, we're seeing a lot of interest here. So thank you very much for those remarks, and we'll come back to questions later. Moving on to our fourth speaker, Ghanshyam Tiwari. I'd just like to quickly introduce Ghanshyam. Ghanshyam is the founder and national coordinator for Parliamentarians and Innovators for India, or PII, or PI India. This is an initiative that was recently set up by Ghanshyam, which basically brings together a group of eminent members of parliament across political parties, along with a group of impact investors and innovators like Asha Impact and other funds, and public policy experts in healthcare. And this is essentially a committee which meets once a week and with a secretariat that Ghanshyam has set up, which is evaluating, I would say, more than several dozen proposals. Ghanshyam can tell us exactly how many, but like the ACT grants, anyone who's working on something important COVID related, and these are not just venture-backed companies, but often NGOs, civil society initiatives in a variety of areas, from data science, community health, to feed IT workers. PII is essentially connecting all of these initiatives with parliamentarians who are interested in applying these in their respective constituencies, essentially helping these NGOs scale up. Prior to this, Ghanshyam has been an alumnus of the Harvard Kennedy School and IIM Bangalore. He has worked in the policy space, advising multiple chief ministers and parliamentarians, as well as large development organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He was the founder of the Harvard India Conference. And most recently, Ghanshyam was the national spokesperson for the Samajwadi Party and a candidate for the parliamentary elections from Bihar in 2019. So Ghanshyam, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we would love it if you can share a little bit about your work at PII and how specifically some of these innovations that different NGOs are working on can be scaled up in partnership with MPs and other government agencies.
Thank you, Kartik. Good morning, everyone. It is great to be part of this discussion that is stirring the minds of people across the country, and also giving a compass to everyone who's working on COVID across the country. And it is great to hear from Sudha, from Viraj, Ashok. We'll hear from Sundeep, people who are doing phenomenal work in the face of this pandemic that is shaking the foundations of how we as a society live. When I started looking at COVID situation, this was before Government of India took notice of COVID situation. I saw that much like some of the political actors who are not in government, I saw that there's a major challenge coming, and we have to take up this challenge politically, as enterprise, as startups, as not-for-profits, in a way that we can save the country from the misery that this challenge will face, both in social life, for the poor, and in terms of economy. So while my political position was clearly defined that it was mindless to put the country on a lockdown with a 4-hour notice and then go into a kirtan and diya mode without doing anything substantial when it was staring in our face. In February, we wasted time in Namaste Trump. In March, we wasted time in ensuring that the Madhya Pradesh government falls. But that's my political position. That did not stop me from thinking about what will be the role of members of parliament in India in the face of this crisis. We have nearly 800 members of parliament with their MP-led fund that would have been 4,000 crores that was taken away. Yet these are people with high public standing, decades of work in public life, and they cover every district across the country, every state across the country. So that thought that governments are at the forefront of responding to COVID, members of parliament have huge public standing within the scope of government, and as a result, we need to communicate a bipartisan united response to COVID. That led to form a foundation of parliamentarians with Innovators for India, piindia.org, where the focus is, can we really bring together members of parliament across party lines? We have today politicians, parliamentarians from more than 10 parties, 12 states, who come together every week to discuss solutions that have come from across the country to focus on COVID situation. And these solutions are really, while our focus was healthcare, these solutions have covered all kinds of spaces. I would showcase a solution that in some way I nudged with a team that was already working on this space, which is the case of missed vaccines in India. we will have probably 1 million kids who would miss their vaccines because of this lockdown. And this is the first time we will have such a pending backlog of kids missing the vaccine. Then there are situations where we can use used containers to create, to augment the spaces where clinics are there to serve both healthcare professionals as well as patients, as well as migrants. There's a case where somebody from IIT Delhi has created a mask which is as good as N95 mask, and we are looking at the possibility of tying up with members of parliament, IITs across the country, IIMs, so that these IITs and IIMs become the nodal agencies where these masks can be distributed. We are looking at the problem that blood banks are going to run dry, and how do we need to mobilize solutions towards that. With Sundeep and several other innovators, we looked at how do we feed people in this situation when hunger becomes a critical thing. One challenge that I have faced in building this up is obviously the aspects that funds are not available is there. This is entirely a voluntary exercise, and as I raise funds towards that, we are in that phase. But funds have not been an issue because people have readily given their time, skills, and conviction to build it up. But the real challenge that I face, where Nudge and this entire activity can play a huge role, is in the last 5 years, when I built a startup in education here in India, I saw that our canvas of innovation is limited. It is limited because it is often run by engineers, bankers, CAs, MBAs, right? And as a result, its core access is technology, limited life experience, limited knowledge of social sectors, health sector, important sectors. As a result, we try to solve the same problem with a solution we already have. So it is important for us together to collaborate and expand this canvas of what the problem is. Today, with eminent journalists, Barkha and Faye, who was there yesterday and spoke about some of the problems. I think the problems are staring us in our face. The problem is that the political leadership has not been beefed up sufficiently to face this situation. As we think about centralized response, we also think about the power of democracy, which is really decentralized response. So technologically, we can think about how capable our individual panchayats are or how local bodies are to face this crisis. We have edtech solutions that can teach them. We can look at what is the level of knowledge that exists in medical or healthcare workers in Bihar or Eastern UP that will face a bunch of the bulk of the migrant crisis. And can we beef that up with knowledge that exists in Maharashtra, in Karnataka? So technology can do it, but it is important that together we expand the canvas for those who are willing to solve through innovations in this situation. Finally, I would like to say that collectively, this is a moment where if I take an analogy, Titanic is sinking. Titanic is the old world order, right? We can have an imagination of what the new world order will be, but what really counts is what is our role in this moment of crisis. If we take a pole position, whatever be our role, right? Be it education for those who are missing education because of lack of mobile phones in their hand, be it mobilizing political leadership, mobilizing the professional talent pool in India. We have 45 million people on LinkedIn, and it is time, while we stay home, stay safe, we don't switch off. We ask everyone that what are you doing to solve a problem right now that improves lives in your local community, your local area tomorrow, right? So I think collectively, it is that moment of leadership as well as crisis where we have to provoke everyone, politically, apolitically, citizens, professionals, that what can you do beyond money to solve for this situation? And as these images play in front of us, which is about misery of migrants, right? At one level, they may make us indifferent about it because we are just seeing too many of them. But if we are empathetic, it will not make us indifferent. It should make us think. It should tell us that we need to step up and do something. So at PI India, we have done call for solutions focused on health. We will be doing soon a call for solutions focused on migrants, rural education, employment and jobs. And I would invite collaboration to do what I think is the most important thing, which is a call for problems, which is tying up with organizations that have worked in a dedicated manner in specific areas to come on a common platform and narrate one problem that they think that people can solve irrespective of the government and can solve in a decentralized manner. So these are the three things. I would like to take a couple of more minutes to play one video that just highlights how massive one problem that is not in the limelight is going to become for the country that we are trying to solve. Aparna or Kartik, if you can play the video.
We'll just play that video. Aparna? Aparna, you're on mute. Huh? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Barriers to getting their children vaccinated. We work with health departments in Bihar and Maharashtra to send reminders to all families. Work with prominent medical colleges in Maharashtra.
So while this comes up, and basically what we are looking at is that how do we tackle this situation where kids are going to miss vaccines? In a lot of poor areas, kids would go into these health melas where vaccines would be given. We are a global success case on immunization, but will that success case remain? Depends on how we react to the situation. And that's what this video will tell us.
I apologize for the technical difficulties, Ghanshyam. What we'll do is we'll share the YouTube link for the video in the chat, and we'll share it with all the speakers. But if you don't mind, just in the interest of time, we'll just quickly cover Sundeep, and then we can come back to the Q&A. So Sundeep, Narwani, welcome. Sundeep is also associated with implementing some of the PII projects on the ground. Just to give a brief introduction, Sundeep is an engineer who turned into a social entrepreneur, who turned into a journalist, turned into a civil society activist. So Sundeep has been active with the Delhi government's Delhi Dialogue Commission and a member of the Admi party, and basically playing the role of a facilitator between the government and civil society organizations, and very, very active in the COVID response in the state of Delhi. So Sundeep, it'll be great to hear your perspective overall on what's really happening on the ground, right? What is the specific context of Delhi? There's some unique things happening here. For example, in February, a lot of the NGOs had come together for food relief. So that inherent collaboration amongst NGOs was picked up on by COVID. And then of course, the proactiveness that you guys as the Aam Aadmi Party have shown in appointing people in each constituency to work with these NGOs. So if you could share your overall thoughts about civil society, government collaboration, Sundeep, and then specifically some of these initiatives, PII related or otherwise, that you're working on the ground right now, which really demonstrate how civil society is working with NGOs to address the COVID challenge.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kartik. And thanks to the Nudge Foundation, Nasha, in fact, for inviting me here. I'm very grateful to you. And I'll start with the story about the one which you just mentioned about the NGOs coming together. This is a story that I think is a perfect example of distributed leadership on the ground. There were riots in Delhi in late February. That's something that we'll never forget. But there was a time in crisis when a lot of NGOs came together, those who were perhaps who had never done riot relief before in their lives. And they started serving communities who were affected by the riots. This collective was called Delhi Relief Collective. They made a WhatsApp group, and little did they know that there was a COVID pandemic to follow very soon. As soon as the COVID pandemic happened, this collective was the first one that became the first response team from the civil society in helping out people. As we all know, the lockdown happened with a very, very small warning. So there were all kinds of problems that were happening in the first few days of the lockdown. And I'm going to briefly just run through those, remind you all about those issues, and then come to the solutions that the government came up with. One of them was, of course, stranded migrants. Second one was a food shortage in many parts. And thirdly was the health crisis, of course. In all three, I thought that the NGOs played a very critical role. I'm going to tell you two examples of how the Delhi government has used NGOs has interwoven with NGOs to have a coherent response to the COVID crisis. The first one is that the Deputy Chief Minister himself of the state, Mr. Manish Sisodia, formed an advisory group under him, which had NGO representatives in it. And the second example is that we had one NGO representative mapped to each district of Delhi. So there would be perfect coordination in terms of feedback from the ground and expertise coming from NGOs inside the system. I thought that both these mechanisms were very effective in the first few days of the lockdown in getting not just high quality people inside the system, but also to kind of plug gaps which would otherwise have taken far more longer for the system to plug on its own. There were some great things that the NGOs did by themselves without the state, and I have to highlight those as well. In this one is that the NGOs were cooperating within themselves. Like I said, the Delhi Relief Collective was one of them, which grew. And during the riot stage, maybe there were 20, but right now there must be maybe 80 or 100 NGOs in that group. The NGOs grew in strength, and the bigger NGOs started working with the smaller NGOs, which I thought was quite something, because for things like verification of beneficiaries for direct cash transfer, it was the smaller local NGOs at the last mile which were able to do that very effectively, while some of the other NGOs, the bigger ones in other states, were transferring the money. The second thing is about the repatriation of migrant workers. It was extremely difficult for community workers to operate in this environment when there was a health hazard for themselves, and but kudos to them. I think the civil society again stepped up and did something that's unprecedented. I hope that the work will continue, because we're still not even out of the lockdown yet, and we still have some way to go ahead. And that's where I want to thank Ghanshyam and his team, who've been incredible in sourcing innovations to us. And I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about our experience with PII. PII has kind of brought in a lot of optimistic innovators inside the system. And the good thing about working with these innovators is that they don't have any baggage. They're completely new. They're not from civil society or from the NGO sector. They're professionals like Ghanshyam just mentioned, and who wanted to change the world, who had a great idea, and they wanted to step up in the times of crisis and do something. We've been able to implement a couple of innovations that have come from PII, and the learnings that I have had that innovators don't actually need much from the state. First thing is that they need a bunch of permissions to wade the system. Because they don't understand the bureaucratic machinery, the governance mechanisms. So every now and then, an innovator would need a little bit of hand-holding to navigate and wade through the system. The second is most innovators require data to operate. Some data points, critical data points that are not in public domain, perhaps. And lastly, I think innovators do have a need for financial capacity, which I think the state is very capable in connecting them with other partners. So we had a really good innovator coming through from PII, who's going to be doing corona simulations. And of course, it's a big project, but we've been able to connect that innovator with IIT Bombay, who has received a grant from MHRD to do corona simulations. So hopefully, innovators will plug in their resources with each other, intellectual and financial, and come up with some groundbreaking products. And I would say that in the end, before I wrap up, the system, the public delivery system itself, at times creates inequities, rather unfortunately. But these inequities can be plugged only when innovators come in at different stages, not just the last mile, but also within the system. So I hope that not just Delhi, but even other states will start welcoming innovators within the system. And right now, our dire need is to plug gaps mainly in the food supply machinery, because as you all know, that if that most of the population, like maybe 70, to give you a number, 72 lakh people in Delhi are dependent on the ration system, on the PDS system, and then we've got another temporary ration scheme as well, which is again catering to about 10 to 12 lakh people. So beyond this 72 and 12 lakhs, Delhi has a population of 2 crore people, 20 million people, and we still have a lot of people who are out of the safety net, and that's where the innovators can play a huge role, massive role. I'll end with that and look forward to some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sundeep, and thanks to all of you. I think this was a very, very interesting discussion, and we've heard of a lot of examples. I've just tried to summarize 5 key points, one from each of you, in terms of the 5 key takeaways, which I'll just quickly summarize, and then we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions. So I'll read out those questions, and anyone who wants to respond can respond. So in summary, I think, what are some of the key takeaways here? Number 1, as Sudha mentioned, there's really a need to improve the ease of doing business. I love that phrase for NGOs, and that NGOs are facing a difficult funding landscape. So this is a very, very critical topic. As Viraj said, tech is not enough. Of course, tech is critical in terms of having solutions, but it's really about the policies and ecosystems. And you also mentioned a very interesting point that often if a not-for-profit is delivering the services, it generates greater credibility than the private sector, like with your COVID pass. So NGOs are well placed if they're tech-enabled to collaborate and build that ecosystem. Mr. Kamath, you gave some amazing examples of the innovations that your organizations and leading NGOs are doing. And what really struck out, what really stood out was the huge numbers involved in terms of, all those people in the public sector that you're able to mobilize, whether it's, school teachers or community workers or so forth. And again, this emphasis on simple tech, right? But which is well delivered, which can be a simple smartphone which 5 people can use at home. So it's really about the scale that comes with government and the efficient delivery. Ghanshyam mentioned some amazing points about the importance of localization and decentralization, about mobilizing professionals to work on these problems, sharing of best practices, and how you do need the right type of political buy-in to enable that. And of course, Sundeep spoke further about some of those examples. And I like how you ended it, Sundeep, by saying that it's not as complicated as we think. At the end of the day, if there's an openness on the part of government, innovators just need some permissions and some data. And then this connecting of the dots, this glue between civil society and governments, precisely what all of you are working on. So it was very, very insightful, and thank you guys for sharing all of that. I personally have a few questions myself, but we don't have too much time. So maybe I can select one of the questions which has come in here. And really, I guess it's about collaboration, right? So one question is, what should be the role of the state government versus the private sector in service delivery to citizens? Is it a case of balance, or is it a case of the government becoming more of an enabler and moving more towards private provision? Because often, sometimes people say that the private sector shouldn't be involved in certain things, right? And there's this confusion. Do you mean the for-profit private sector or the not-for-profit private sector? So perhaps if each of you can just maybe give a short closing comment on overall what you see as the role of the state, if you were to advise, your state government, what should they do? If we can just maybe go across and have each of you share, your closing thoughts, that would be helpful.
So it is music to my ears to hear Ghanshyam and Sundeep speak, and this question that falls right in. I think the role of the state government is to actively scout for innovations and new ways of solving old problems. COVID has provided that wonderful inflection point in which this has become possible. Not just people that have made it their life's work to solve problems as non-profits, but also probably innovators who will do it for short bursts of time. I think the government has a responsibility to scout for these actively through channels like PII, and bring it into public systems, supporting with money where needed. And maybe even make a budgetary allocation in this financial year for such innovations, not leave it to serendipity.
That's a great idea. Ghanshyam?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is truly, while the Prime Minister spoke about being vocal about local, but truly this is a hyper-local movement of India, where because of social distancing, travel issues, each village is its own mini republic, or each town is its own mini republic, and one can look at the skill pool of that village, the resource pool available, the idea pool available. You can think about something as simple as LinkedIn groups for each member of parliament that focus on that particular district, that particular constituency. And as a result, the role of the state is really to be the incubator of ideas, but it is eventually the products and services have to be locally deployed by local people. If collectively, all of us with our effort in the next 1 month, let us say identify one good not-for-profit or for-profit or a team that is working in one block across the country, right? Across more than 700 districts that we in India have, right? That would be huge service, because we give that team, not-for-profit, for-profit credibility. They become the engines of that hyper-local setup in India, and it suddenly changes the vantage point with which we operate, from the point of doing something end-to-end doing something to the end that will deliver eventually.
Absolutely. Viraj, Mr. Kamath, anything you guys wanted to add?
Yeah, so let me just, take it in a more concrete manner. So if you take, this Android app that we talked about, the building blocks, right? So it required funding from the corporate sector. In this case, it was Cisco to help us create that problem, the product, right? Then when it comes to delivery, you need multiple channels. The state government pitched in by printing textbooks. So to give you a sense, in June of 2020, across 4 states, 33 million textbooks would have QR codes that will link it to this. Okay, so that's a large, reach, if you will, right? And to make that happen, we had to unbundle things so that it's aligned chapter by chapter to the text. So there's that little bit of work. During the COVID time, when education volunteers go door to door, that's the last mile delivery that's important. So I think you need to be able to take all of these we've done it across 1 state at this point. And of course, the Diksha platform is across 4 states, but nothing to prevent all things going across the entire country.
I think when you look at service delivery over a longer period of time, I think the government's role has to be, I think, 2, and that's a common across any delivery. I would say first is creating some foundational infrastructure. I mean, you take highways as an example. Government builds the highways, then puts the policies around who pays for it, what is the revenue share, what are the specs for building it. So I think creating foundational infra is quite important. I think that's something government is uniquely placed to do because it needs investment and it needs certain and linked to that is policy. Can you create enabling policies? I think some of the things we have had so many innovators come to us saying, we want to build something on top of it. But can the government procure it? Can there be a policy around procuring small startups and, testing those things out? So I think unless there's a enabling policies that government creates, we had wonderful, there's Smart Loo, you guys know from Nudge Foundation, right? He's got a wonderful solution to smartify the toilets and he can use our infra to build it. But really, for the government to procure it and scale it, it is extremely hard with the current procurement policies. So I think one of the key things government should solve for, and COVID is a great example of, some of the unsolved policy issues actually come in the way, right? To actually do things quickly. So I think unless some of the policy roadblocks are removed and you have enabling policies, recognizing that you need to have local innovation, right? Just getting innovators together may not actually solve problem. In a crisis, it might, because everybody has a gun on their head. But on a long-term basis, it'll be extremely hard in my mind. So I think policies and infra. I mean, Diksha is a great example of infra. It's a infra that government has provided. Yeah. It's a standard infra that any educator who has content can use it to promote their content, and that gives you scale across the country. So those are the 2 points I want to make.
Wonderful. Well, look, we're right on the hour, so I wanted to once again thank all of you. And that last point, Viraj, that you made is a perfect segue into our next session, which I hope you will all stay around for, which is a keynote session moderated by Pramod Bhasin, along with 2 speakers from the policy world, Jasmine Shah from the Delhi Dialogue Commission and Mr. Deepak Singhal, IAS, who was the former Chief Secretary of UP. So right after this, in fact, we're going to be looking at some of those policy issues. And again, I'd like to thank all of you for being part of this discussion to discuss how NGOs and civil society can partner with government. And now we'll listen to the perspective from the government.